Welcome and thanks to all of you for coming. You are lovers of architecture and history, and your contributions to these various societies, which are listed, are invaluable, and I hope you'll keep supporting all of them, the library and the Filson and all the other groups. When you hear what we have to say about these buildings and the history surrounding how they happen to be built, you'll have, we hope, a different appreciation of each and every one of these buildings. Now, you don't have an image of it yet, but Scott's going to show the spiral staircase in the old state capitol in Frankfurt, where we lectured yesterday. The keystone at the top of that step, that circular step, weighs about 2.5 tons. Each of the steps weighs about 440 pounds, and the whole ensemble weighs 21,000 pounds. Now, when you know those facts, this is what history does for you in the present. You can't walk up those steps without admiring the precision with which Shryock applied to make them. They're 190 years old, and millions of people have gone up and down them, and they're just like new. I want to thank the sponsors, and really they've all been mentioned. Paul Burns at the Louisville Free Public Library. Julie James helped sponsor this, and I certainly want to re-mention Dick Clay. And Dick, you were a huge help in getting this ground off the ground. I want to mention Steve Weiser, who couldn't be here. He's in Austin, actually, this weekend. And he's, of course, from the Louisville Historic League. And I want to thank Carmichael's and all the other groups that you see on the screen. Those are our promotional partners, we call them. This book is a collaboration. The chief collaborator, of course, is Scott Gill, and we have talked about every sentence and every picture and everything else in this book more than one time. The other collaborators I do want to take a second to mention would include Tom Owen, who's at Special Collections at U of L, and he just has done a lot of work to help us find the various images. Jim Holmberg at the Filson, David Morgan at the University of Louisville in archives, and he helped us dig up old minute books that were dated 1835, if you can imagine that, dusty and so forth and so on, finding the history that we wanted to find out about the Jefferson County Courthouse and City Hall. Mary Marlott, who's at the Kornhauser Library, and she's here. She helped us find a lot of the information on the Louisville Institute. They have original records, some books that were in the fire that you'll hear about. Savannah Darr is Louisville Metro, and she's in planning and design. And we thought there were 2 buildings on Main that he did, and it turned out after about a month of working that he did a duplex on Main Street. Nobody's ever known about that, so that'll be new news to anybody that's a fan of Shryock. Jay Ferguson at the Louisville Water Company. The Bridwell Art Library, Gail Gilbert and Kathy Moore. Don Meredith, Retrographics, who did a lot of the scans for us. Mary Jean Kinsman, who did some of the work for us and found that wonderful 1855 bird's eye view of the city of Louisville that is several places in our book. And finally, Butler Books, who and Scott Storts with Butler Books and Carol, who did a marvelous job of laying out the book. The big question is, why Shryock? Well, Scott says I emailed him 7 years ago in October of 2014 and said, Scott, I think I have another book in me. I can't believe I really did that. But in any event, his response was, in October the 14th, would we consider something on Gideon Shryock? Well, I knew the name. I knew that he had done the Jefferson County Courthouse. And of course, I grew up in Frankfurt, as I'll mention later. And so I couldn't have written, though, much more than a paragraph about him if you'd have asked me to in 2014. So anyway, we talked about an article, and Richard Guy Wilson at the University of Virginia said, no, you need to be doing a book. And finally, we committed ourselves to doing a book. And it only took us 7 years. And during those years, Scott gets his PhD in architectural history. Another question, and then I'll get to his life, is how does a trial lawyer end up his career authoring books with a PhD in architectural history? Well, it's not as esoteric as you think. I grew up in Old Frankfort. I attended the Church of the Ascension. 3.5 blocks in one direction is the old Capitol, which is a Shryock building. 3.5 blocks in another direction is the Franklin County Courthouse. My father had his medical office there for 50 years, right next door to the Franklin County Courthouse. And 3 or 4 blocks in another direction, actually south, is the Orlando Brown House. So it's not as if I weren't around some fairly handsome architecture, but also around Gideon Shryock. And I've practiced law in the Franklin County Court. Also, I attended the University of Virginia and had the privilege of living on Mr. Jefferson's lawn my 4th year in college and my 3rd year in law school. And I tell you right now, I would spend another year there if I could figure out some way to work that deal. It was a beautiful place for a student to live. Finally, lawyers do nothing but research things they don't know about. We get a new file, and whether it involves coal mining or the Coleman lantern or the Bic lighter or, I don't know, neurosurgery or orthopedic, whatever subject it is, we start out and we know next to nothing. So it was not unusual for me to start a project that I knew actually very little about. Now turn your mind to before and after 1800 in central Kentucky. We've said in the book that Shryock was born and lived in exciting times. Now, if I may quote from our own book, it was an era when a complex assortment of Americans from the eastern United States, European immigrants, and enslaved Africans crossed the Allegheny Mountains into the native territory of Kentucky to build a better life for themselves. Mr. Shryock was born in the midst of this wave of immigrants, and he was born in 1802 in Lexington. His father, Matthias, had married a woman, Mary Elizabeth Gaw in Baltimore, and moved her and her brother, which was Matthias's partner, to Lexington to do construction work. A fun description of Lexington in 1806, which is 4 years after Gideon moved there, is provided by J. Winston Coleman. He says, the growth of Lexington, the frontier metropolis, or Athens of the West, as it came to be known, was rapid indeed. When Joseph Charles published the first city directory in 1806, the town boasted of 104 brick, 10 stone, 187 frame and log houses. In addition to these buildings, there was a courthouse, a jail, a market house, and 4 places of public worship, a handsome lodge for Freemasons, an insurance office, the Transylvania University with 5 professors, and a public library on the corner square. What more could you want? But that's pretty much what Lexington was like and was the situation that Shryock was born in. We know almost nothing and could find almost nothing about his childhood or what his hobbies were. But in 1816, he attended Mr. Ulridge's Lancastrian School for Boys, and he would have gotten a vigorous and a rigorous classical education in that private school. In 1823, he was lucky enough to get accepted by William Strickland, who was a leading architect in Pennsylvania, to mentor with him for a whole year. And at the time, Philadelphia had 65,000 people. And at that time, Lexington would have had 2,000. So you can just imagine what an experience that was for him. His first letter home, which we've published in the book, he starts out by saying, "My dear parents, I take the first opportunity of informing you of my safe arrival in this place. I have seen William Strickland, and he says he will do anything in his power to instruct me. I'm to go with him tomorrow to look at some of the public buildings in the city, and then he will let me know what I had better do." In a second letter, he's so polite through all of his correspondence. It just touches me in a way. What a dutiful young man he was. In the second letter, dated January 18, 1824, he says, "I thank God I'm enjoying good health." He always says that in every letter. "I went with the Reed family on Christmas Eve to the Philadelphia Museum and had the pleasure of spending the evening very agreeably in the same house and part of the time in the same room where the Declaration of Independence was signed." So you can only imagine what a thrill it was for a 21-year-old man to have that year in Philadelphia. After he returned from his apprenticeship, the old state capitol in Frankfort burned to the ground. They had a contest. He reluctantly, according to family, submitted a proposal. The family lore says his friends talked him into doing it because he'd never really done anything before then. And he won the contest. And he began work on the state capitol in 1827 at the age of 25. And Scott's going to talk more about this, but this would have been an amazingly challenging commission. He had no staff. He had no draftsmen. He had to do all the invoices. He had to approve all the work that was being done. And I have a feeling he probably slept on the site if he got it built in 2 years. They had 70 or 80 people from the penitentiary, which were allowed to come and work during the day and then go back to the penitentiary at night. The governor of Kentucky at that time was named Governor Thomas Metcalf. He was the 10th governor. And of all things, he was a stonemason. And everybody referred to him as Old Stonehammer. And who knows, this is my speculation, maybe Old Stonehammer even chiseled on one of the columns in the old state capitol, because I'm sure he was on site. But anyway, in the midst of all that, while he's building that building, he gets a letter from his sister. And I'm sure some of you can relate to this. This letter was written on I skipped a page. It was written in August of 1827. And she's writing from Lexington to Gideon, who's in Frankfort working on the Capitol. And she says, "I cannot refrain from expressing my surprise and disappointment at your not being present at my exam at the Lafayette Academy. In vain we looked for you, Wednesday and Thursday. You came not. And my examination has passed without my dear brother being here to sanction my best endeavors to give him and myself honor." Then she goes on, "But I know your absence was unavoidable, or else, knowing how very much I wished you to be here, you certainly would have come. So I am satisfied." And that's his younger sister. After he won the commission at the old state capitol, he got a lot of other commissions. He got some wonderful, can we have the next slide? He got some wonderful publicity out of it. And we found in the New York Public Library this image. This is the first image of the old state capitol that was ever in print. The artist lived in Portland, in Louisville. He was an Englishman. He did a painting, and that was sent to Philadelphia. And I tried every way I could to find who the engraver was, but I wasn't successful. But this was published in a high-end art magazine in Philadelphia in 1833. And I can only imagine that his mentor, William Strickland, was proud of his student when he saw that he had gotten published in a leading magazine in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So anyway, that's, and Scott's going to talk a lot more about that. So quickly, following that, he did the Franklin County Courthouse, which I've mentioned, which is coming up there, and you can see that building to the right of it's where my father was for 50 years. And I used to go in there with an office room full of patients waiting to see him and ask him for money, and he would come out in his white coat and give me money so that I could go buy something across the street. So this brings back a lot of memories in my mind. But in any event, after the Franklin County Courthouse, and that's the I have to mention this. Chief Judge Philip Shepard is the chief judge there, and he has his wonderful courtroom there, and he took Scott and I up in the lantern. And if you look at the picture of the lantern, at this point, we're about halfway up. And that's when I got scared and said, I'm going down, because it was just looking awfully dangerous to me. But in any event, Scott took a lot of pictures of the interior of the lantern, and it's all just like new inside. And then after he did the Franklin County Courthouse, he did the commission for the state capitol in Little Rock, Arkansas. The way he got that is John Pope was a Kentucky senator, and he would have known him. He was there at the same time Shryock was building the old state capitol. Pope got made the governor of the territory of Arkansas, and so he wrote to Shryock, and he said, I want you to do as beautiful a building for me in Little Rock as you've done in Frankfort. And it's a complicated story because it was revised slightly, but that's the building that is still standing, and it's a museum in Little Rock. And I think Little Rock had a population of 600 when that building was built. And so that's impressive. Then after that, James Guthrie, and most of you Louisville will at least know that name, who was a big deal in Louisville if there ever was one, he hired Shryock to do the Jefferson County Courthouse. Scott's going to talk about that, so I'm going to pass it. But it was a magnificent project. And then he did the Louisville Institute. Oh, I've skipped Orlando Brown, so let me backtrack just a minute. That's 2 blocks. That's in the same block in Frankfort as Liberty Hall. And it's a wonderful house, and the porch is significant, and we're not going to cover all this. It's too much to cover in an afternoon, but anyway. And now I'll talk about the Louisville Institute, Scott, if you put that up. As the city architect, he was getting $2,000 a year, and he was getting more than the mayor was, but it enabled him to design the buildings for the city that they were going to pay, the city and the county were going to pay for. And this was Louisville's first medical school. It was completed in 1838, and Guthrie tried to steal all of the faculty from the medical school in Lexington, and there was a big row about that. But eventually about half the faculty came. And one of the reasons they wanted to do a first-rate medical school was the canal had been completed in Louisville. There was a huge amount of river traffic, and there were a huge amount of illnesses and injuries. And so they needed a first-rate medical school. And that building at the time that it was built was as good as any building in the country, as far as we can tell, or as far as our research shows. And unfortunately, 25 years later, it burned down, and then it was rebuilt with the facade, no, not exactly the same, but similar to, and then it was finally destroyed around 1900. Very quickly, after that building, he did a chapel called the Sihon Chapel, and it was in 3rd and Guthrie, and it was for the Methodists. And their doctrine was that their buildings should be chaste and simple. Well, when you read the article about this building, which is dated 1850, this building was anything but chaste, and it was anything but simple. It was a really beautiful building inside out. And Calvary Episcopal Church, which is just a block from here, inhabited this building from 1860 to 1872, and when their new church was built. So it became an Episcopal church, and then later it became a Methodist church, and it stood at that location until 1900. The next church that he did, I want to mention briefly. The First Baptist Church was in this area, and they had as many blacks as they had whites. It was about 500 and 500. They had a charismatic minister whose name was Henry Adams, and he said, can we have our own church? And so the powers that be said, you can, we'll make a mission church. So they first inhabited a house, and then they bought a small church, and then lo and behold, in 1854, they hired Gideon Shryock to design what is now the 5th Street Baptist Church. Now, the building is gone. The congregation is at 19th and Jefferson. But that's the church that he designed, and the blacks did all the work, all the carpentry, all the work on the whole building. And I think that is a fascinating read if you're interested in the complicated history of Louisville, because at the time that church was being built, there were lynchings and there were people in chains being shipped down the Mississippi River. And that church was built in a white neighborhood. So it's just an amazing conglomeration of things that are happening. One more church, and then I want to wrap it up. This is the Chestnut Street Methodist Church, which he built during the Civil War. It faces Chestnut, but it's at the corner of 8th and Chestnut. And this was his last major project. It was started in 1863 and completed in 1864. And it's a very substantial building. Interestingly, Scott had the inspiration to look at some old books that Shryock might have had access to, and he found an image of Zitelli, which is a church in Venice, Italy, which is still there, which was built 300 years ago, or from the time this was built. And when you compare them side by side, as we do in the book, this is clearly something that Shryock had seen the image. There's no way 300 years later he could have designed a building that had a facade that looked as similar to that without having seen that image. So I think that's fascinating. I want to wrap up now with a couple of quotes from Shryock himself. This is May 19th, 1874, and a group of Louisville's preeminent architects met, and they established the first trade organization for Louisville architects, and they elected Gideon at the age of 72 president. This was new news that's never been mentioned in all the different stuff that's been written about Shryock. So he gave an elaborate speech. We have a complete copy of it, and we quote extensively from it. But this is just to give you a little flavor of what his mindset was as a 72-year man at the twilight of his career. He first recaps the satisfaction that he had gained in his life from working in architecture. And then he continues with an entreaty to the vast potential in American architecture. And he says, I hope men will rise above their present degraded and corrupt condition and become honest and pure in thoughts, words, and actions. And our architecture, so extremely simple and beautiful in style, so elegant, magnificent, and grand in proportion, and perfect and complete in its execution, as to become the admiration of the world and a model for imitation by all the nations of the earth. So he has retained that idealism and ambition and love of architect in his twilight years. I want to read briefly from his obituary, which was written by a man he'd known all his life. The writer of this has known, I'm quoting, has known him intimately for the space of 67 years. Mr. Shryock was a thorough master of this profession in all its parts. He followed his profession quietly, successfully. He was a very faithful member of the Baptist Church. He was an excellent husband, a kind father, and an earnest, excellent friend. He leaves a wife and 4 sons and 4 daughters who are worthy of such a father as they possessed. Now I want to close and leave a message from an old man, and that would be me, to Mr. Shryock, who's a much older man. And this is my message. Mr. Shryock, you were a very lucky fellow. You were born in a town and at a time in Lexington when building anything was the rage. Even that Greek revival outhouse that you built for old Morrison in Lexington. And that's one of the only original plans that he left that we have, which is a little bit ironic. You were born with high intelligence and a rare talent for architecture. You had loving parents and siblings. You can certainly see what his sister thought of him. And your father was a builder. How lucky is that? You got a good basic education from old Mr. Aldridge at the Lancastrian School. You got accepted to study with William Strickland, a fine architect and in a city of 65,000 persons. When you returned to Lexington, it wasn't long until the old state capitol burned. That was Frankfurt's tragedy, but it certainly was your good luck. But I want to say to you, you took full advantage of all the luck you had. You studied hard, and you educated yourself, and you mastered the history of architecture and how to build buildings. You became well educated, which no doubt enabled you to be conversant with the other well-educated persons who were your clients, and that would include people like Henry Clay, John Crittenden in Frankfurt, the John Pope that I mentioned, who was the governor of the territory, James Guthrie in Louisville, et cetera, et cetera. You were very courageous to undertake the designing of a building like the old state capitol. Your resume at the time you undertook that commission would have fit on a half a page, or a fourth of a page probably. And that could well have ruined your career, but you were courageous enough to accept the commission and you pulled it off. You also took your subsequent projects seriously. And you gave Lexington, Frankfurt, and Louisville something of which to be proud, and even Little Rock. It is obvious that you were a beloved son, sibling, husband, and father, and it must be a comfort to you that you are buried in Cave Hill Cemetery with all 9 of your children, and of course your wife. So I say, Mr. Shryock, for myself and your admirers, you are an inspiration and a role model for all of us, and we are grateful to you that you came our way. Thank you very much.
I'm going to try this headset. I hope it works. Get that out of the way. Well, thank you again to the Louisville Free Public Library for allowing us to host this event in this wonderful, wonderful room. This is just a treat. And I also want to thank Winfrey. He's a marvelous friend. and a tremendous co-author to work with over, we calculated 16 years of 3 books and 7 years, as he said, this last one. And believe it or not, through all that, we're still fantastic friends. And I think that says a lot. So what I'm going to talk about today is entitled Gideon Shryock, Master of the Greek Revival. And I'm going to highlight an important part of our book. That is the first part of our book that discusses Gideon as the man who brings the Greek revival style of architecture in its full form to Kentucky. And in the process of doing that, becomes a significant and very key player in this national architectural movement. We'll be looking at today Shryock's education as an architect, because that undergirds his whole work, and then the evolution of his architecture through 3 notable works that we cover in the book, all of which are examples of Greek revival architecture. But okay, I keep using this term. What, you may say, is Greek revival? Well, it's the fashion of its day. It's the fashionable style of its day, from Europe to the East Coast of the United States. And in the United States, it sweeps the country starting in the early 1800s, because this originates in Germany and Great Britain. Arrives in the East Coast, starting really with New Yorkish area and Philadelphia, and then works its way west and south. And it's not just architecture that is affected by the Greek revival. It's all encompassing. It includes fashion. It includes the naming of cities. For those of you who can't see that, this is Athens, Georgia. Furniture and interior design includes the fine arts and the decorative arts. And of course, architecture. Here you see the territorial capital of Arkansas by Gideon Shryock. And in architecture, Greek revival could simply be defined as the application of ancient Greek forms to modern day uses. Now, I mentioned his education. Winfrey talked about Gideon's early education and mentioned that he studies under William Strickland. There we go. Let me elaborate on that just a minute. So, first of all, we know that Gideon grows up under his father, Matthias, who was a carpenter and builder of very great note in Lexington. We believe that he worked with his father and obviously demonstrated enough talent that in 1823, his family decided that he needed to go someplace and be trained formally. And that someplace was Philadelphia, which I show you here right before he arrived. Philadelphia, as I think many of you know at that time, was the big city of the United States. It was the cultural capital of the United States, and it was the center of architectural thought. When he arrived there, he would apprentice under William Strickland, who was one of the great masters of American architecture of this era. While working with Strickland, he learns the Greek revival. He learns how to work in the Greek revival. He embraces the Greek revival and brings it home to Kentucky after he's been with Strickland for a mere 1 year. And when he returns to Kentucky, he carries with him the distinction of being the first native son of the state to be trained as an architect. Now, what happens when he's with Strickland? Well, he gets, as I say, formal training, such as it is, because at this time in 1823, there is no program in architecture in a university. That won't come until after the Civil War. So education at that point is based on this centuries-old system of apprenticeship, whereby the student studies under a master, in this case, William Strickland. There he observes, he copies, he assists, and oftentimes the student would work on a building that was under construction. So it was a comprehensive way of learning architecture, very hands-on. But uh, when he's working with Strickland, I might add, that he's becoming a part of a very distinguished architectural fraternity that includes perhaps the most important and significant group of architects in this country at that time. This fraternity really starts with the English transplant Benjamin Latrobe, who had come to Philadelphia in 1798. And Latrobe is often considered the first the first professional architect in the United States. He's known for having overseen the construction of the United States Capitol in Washington and the rebuilding of the Capitol and the White House, which you see here, after the War of 1812. He actually did work in Kentucky as well, designing a home, the Pope Villa, for Senator John Pope, he who Winfrey mentioned as the governor of the Arkansas territories. In the European tradition, Latrobe took on at least two apprentices that we know of. One was from South Carolina, Robert Mills, who would go on to design the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. The other is our friend William Strickland, whose first really notable building I show here, which was the Second Bank of the United States in Philadelphia. It's borrowed directly, the facade, from the Parthenon in Athens and is often considered the first Greek revival building in this country. This building was finishing up when Gideon arrived in Philadelphia. Now, Strickland, in turn, took on at least two apprentices that we know of. One, Thomas Ustick Walter, who designed the great cast iron dome that stands atop the United States Capitol today. And then, of course, our friend Gideon Shryock. Now, thinking about Strickland for a moment and his second bank and that Parthenon, where did he get the idea for that? Because he had never been to Greece. Well, architects at this time, especially Greek revival architects, relied on the use of pattern books, of these volumes that had been published that showed elements of architecture, in this case, Greek architecture, plans, full buildings. They were used for inspiration and models and measurements, and importantly, to assist architects with understanding classical rules of proportion, something that Gideon picked up very, very well. I'm showing you two of the most popular of the era here. One is the Antiquities of Athens, published by James Stewart and Nicholas Rivette. The other, the Society of Dilettantes Antiquities of Ionia, between the two of them covering ancient Greece on either side of the Adriatic. These are both going to be important to us as we move forward here with Gideon. So the authors of these books traveled to Greece, saw the ruins, sketched them, reconstructed them, and then they would see, for instance, certain little extant nuggets like this, the Tower of the Winds, an ancient water clock. And then, of course, they would sketch it and then etch it in their book, which became obviously very available. It included, such illustrations included things like plans with all the dimensions. So, for instance, if you were an English nobleman and you had your estate back home and you wanted a little guest house designed to look very Grecian, well, you might turn to that and have it copied. And by the way, this has also been done. Clay Lancaster, from the Kentucky architectural historian, had this type of building built on his place the Warwick estate near Harrodsburg as a guest house. So and that was in 1992. So the tradition continues. But one thing I want to point out is that Greek Revival architects were never just mere copyists. They used these books, they used ancient Greek forms as a springboard, as inspiration, because then they still had to take these forms and then adapt them for contemporary use, as we will see. For instance, in ancient Greek, the Tower of the Winds was a water clock. It wasn't 2 stories with a ballroom on the second floor that you can rent today with Georgian windows in it. Now, I said that Gideon stayed in Philadelphia for a year. And not long after he got back home to Lexington, there was a minor tragedy that Winfrey mentioned in Frankfurt, and that was that the State House, which was declared fireproof when it was built in 1816, you know what happens next? It burned to the ground. And about 2 years later, after much haggling, a competition was announced for its replacement. 21 days were provided for submission of proposals, but after only 7, the winner was declared, which was the young 25-year-old Gideon Shryock. Family lore says that the other competitors saw what Gideon had submitted and deemed it so superior to what they had designed that they withdrew their proposals. Needless to say, this was an amazing achievement for the 25-year-old Gideon, because at this point, to our knowledge, and at least as the records indicate and what survives, he really hadn't designed anything of particular note. We believe he was working with his father while also working as an architect. But what he comes up with is truly a remarkable building that some consider to be his very, very best. Let's take a look at it. For his inspiration, he turned to none other than the Antiquities of Ionia, which I just mentioned. And there, thumbing through it, he locked on to the temple of Minerva Polias in Priene in modern-day Turkey. And this hexastyle, 6 columns, Ionic, the column capitals have the little ram's horns on them. This hexastyle Ionic column, temple front, he turned into his winning design with the addition of a lantern on top. And this is something else that you need to understand with Greek Revival architects, as we will see particularly with this building, that they're not purists. So he's borrowed the front from the temple, but then because temples did not have occupiable space inside, this is going to be a state house. He puts windows down the side and he needs to bring light into the center. So he, like other architects of his era, put a lantern on top to bring that light in. Now, he likely had other inspirations for his design of this building, in addition to the Temple of Minerva Polias, from his time in Philadelphia, starting with Benjamin Latrobe's Bank of Pennsylvania that had been built in 1799 before he arrived. So Gideon would absolutely have seen this, possibly sketched it, or possibly acquired the book printed in 1810 in which this illustration appeared. Or he could have seen British American architect John Haviland's St. Andrew's Episcopal Church, also in Philadelphia, which was going up at the same time that he was there. The influences are uncanny between these. On the left, you have down below Gideon's proposal for the Capitol, and on the right down below, the Capitol is finally built as it exists today. So let's go inside for a moment and talk about that famed staircase that Winfrey mentioned earlier. Legend says it was a first. Well, it was actually a first west of the Alleghenies because in New York, the city hall there a few years before had built a stair like this out of stone as well. What's important to note here is that Gideon, in an early letter home from Philadelphia, told his parents that he would love to go to New York and to Baltimore if he had the time while he was up in Philadelphia. We don't know if he did. The record goes very quiet between his early letters home and when he wins the project for the Capitol, but it's quite possible. Regardless, as Winfrey mentioned, and I encourage you folks to go visit this building, the staircase is a, an amazing collaboration of stonemason, engineering talent, and architecture. Because as Winfrey mentioned, it weighs, the whole thing weighs 21,000 pounds, which is, you have to manipulate all these stones. And that was calculated by our good guest here today, Tom Hundley. Thank you, Tom. And this had been made before in wood. And so, if you haven't seen it, it's a stairway that is in a cylinder, and you go up the center flight, then there's a landing, then two other flights. They're floating flights. They come on, they're cantilevered off the wall, and then they go up to the top to the upper landing to the second floor. And the genius of it is it's assembled as an arch really on an angle. And if you're familiar with how an arch works, it goes up with little pie-shaped bricks, stones, what have you, that by themselves would all fall down if it weren't for the keystone at the top that locks everything in place. Well, that's what Gideon has done with this stairway, is that there are the two flying flights on either side, crescent-shaped flights, that go up, and then that 2-ton landing locks them in place. And so all these steps, which are meticulously put together, had to be held up by some sort of wood framework until that final piece was put in. And then, they pulled that framework out, everybody holding their breath. And of course, after that, I don't know if you would have done it, but you first up the stairs. Oh, no, you first up the stairs. So, but it is a remarkable, remarkable piece of work. Now let's go up those stairs, we're brave, into this glorious rotunda. Where do we think that Gideon might have drawn inspiration for this? He could have come up with the idea on his own, or perhaps he made it to Baltimore, where he had family, while he was in Philadelphia, and saw this, the first Unitarian church, the sanctuary of which had been built just a few years before. Or he might have stayed in touch with his cohort in Strickland's office and been aware of this chapel at Strickland's United States Naval Hospital in Philadelphia that was started just shortly before Gideon won the award for the Capitol. What's important here to understand is that Gideon doesn't go to Philadelphia, study for a year, and come back home and hang up a shingle and design pretty houses. He is staying in touch with what is happening in the rest of the country, particularly what is happening in the Northeast of Philadelphia, that cultural capital. He is part of this mix. He may even have made it back to Philadelphia in that time between when we know he returned home and when we know he won the competition. It's very likely that he was either letters, drawings exchanged, or he actually made it back there. And the building is still remarkable today. If you haven't seen it, go. This is an image from the 1920s, and here it is today, where you can see how important that lantern was to his composition. Not only does it bring in light, but it gives additional monumentality to his facade. And one other little detail I want to point out to you that's so wonderful about this, it shows how attentive he was uh, to his architecture, is note that the stone used on the portico itself, the columns and the pediment above, is that kind of darker yellow color set against the wall and back, which is a definitely whiter color, which lets that classical portico read through with tremendous strength. This, for Frankfurt at this time, this had to be quite something to see. Now let's move on to the next project of Gideon's career, the next major project, and that's Morrison College at Transylvania University in Lexington. And here we have what's going to be a familiar story, because the principal building at Transylvania, lovely thing, in 1829, well, guess what happened to it? You guessed it, it burned to the ground, leaving nothing but this pile of ashes. And something else. It left, just like Frankfurt, an architectural opportunity. And let me backtrack just a little bit, give you a little bit of information, a little background on this. Go back to about 1822 or so, when the wealthy entrepreneur, Colonel James Morrison, had his good friend, famed Kentucky statesman Henry Clay, draft his will. And in that will, Morrison left Transylvania $30,000, a very princely sum, to be used to build a building at Transylvania to be named Morrison College. Now, Morrison dies in 1823, and time passes with the usual arguments in there about the estate, but the burning of the old building provided the perfect reason to wrap up all the controversy with his legacy and get going. And so they do. And Transylvania asks for submissions again. And they receive at least two. This one, kind of a riff on Jefferson's Monticello, is by a Mr. Lawkins. That's all we know about him. The other is by Gideon, of course, who wins the competition, likely for two reasons. One, that his fame for the Kentucky State House, and two, for the building that really satisfies what they were looking for. It's a superior building. And I'll explain about that in just a second as I talk about three innovations here that show how Gideon was plugged into the national conversation on the Greek revival. This is a good building for this. First, he gives up on squeezing a modern day function into an ancient building. In this case, he's not trying to put an academic building into a Greek temple as he did in Frankfurt. So what he does is he basically cuts off the most recognizable part of a Greek temple called the portico and applies it to this block of a building behind, three-story building that now unapologetically sports windows, modern day windows, and can serve the functions within well. And the next thing he does is he puts the entrance on the second floor. And by doing that, he allows for this monumental staircase to be built in front, which permits a wonderful procession to the second floor, to the entry. This becomes truly a temple of education. And lastly, he frames that staircase in what is called antipodia. This is a word that Clay Lancaster comes up with. You'll never find it in a dictionary, but it really means in front of the podium. And these are a Roman element, but in a Roman temple, they tend to be smaller. These big, huge, chunky things are an American invention, the best I can tell, as we will see. Again, what Greek revival architects do is they'll borrow from ancient Rome, they'll borrow from ancient Greece, they'll use what they need that day to put together a truly functional and stylish building. So what we have here in Morrison is an all-new marvelous synthesis of ancient form and modern function. And I've said he's in the mix, talking to others, aware of what's going on around the country. You see it here at Strickland's United States Naval Asylum in Philadelphia that's been built just before Morrison. This is the same building that has that chapel that could very well have been the inspiration for the rotunda in Frankfurt. Both buildings share that same vocabulary. And with the portico up front, it has been said that he turned to Stewart and Rivette, one of our other pattern books, to the Temple of Theseus with arguably very pleasing results. Now, after Morrison, as Winfrey discussed, Gideon does 3 major projects. He does 2 in Frankfurt, the Orlando Brown House, his only surviving house, and one of only 2 projects, by the way, the other being the state capitol, that has the interiors substantially as he designed them. The other was the Franklin County Courthouse, which Winfrey showed you. And one in Arkansas, the State House, the Territorial State House. And then in 1835, before the Orlando Brown House is even finished, Gideon skedaddles off to Louisville. And he's coming here to participate in a competition to design a unique combination building. It's going to hold the Jefferson County Courts and the Louisville City Hall. It will be the grandest project he ever designs, and it will be arguably the apex of his work in the Greek Revival. But first, just a smidge of background again. Because Louisville at this time is, to put it nicely, a rather rough and tumble river town. And enter at this time what Winfrey mentioned, good old James Guthrie, who is a businessman, politician, and powerful chairman of the Finance Committee of the Louisville City Council. And in that role, he's in charge of this building. He has a vision for the city. He wants Louisville to become the premier city, period, and economic hub of Kentucky. And he sets out to do that. He paves streets. He puts in streetlights. He improves sanitation, which was a real problem at that time. And he's the one who pushes through the digging of that all-important Louisville and Portland Canal that goes around the Falls of the Ohio for the first time, and therefore opens up the great commercial waterway, that great freeway between New Orleans and Pittsburgh to commercial traffic. And that leads to the great economic boom of Louisville. He also, as Winfrey pointed out, believed that a first-class city needed a first-class educational institution, and that's when, a little bit later in our story here, he engages Gideon to design the Louisville Medical Institute, which is the precursor to the University of Louisville School of Medicine. Anyway, to top all of this off, Guthrie, there we go. Guthrie wants a building. Remember, he's in charge of this joint building. He wants a building that will celebrate this new city that he has envisioned and is trying to create. It's to be a monument. Who better to turn to design this than Gideon Shryock? And of course, Gideon wins the competition, as we know, and he is made city architect. City architect is a new position. It comes with a salary, guaranteed salary, as Winfrey mentioned, and it gives him responsibility for every new project, municipal architecture project. It's a big deal. So what does he end up designing with Guthrie? Well, this. Wow. It's quite something. What better way could you describe this other than a resplendent temple of civic pride. And it's arguably Gideon's masterpiece in the mature Greek revival. In it, we see elements of the Capitol and we see elements of Morrison, all synthesized into a truly monumental, I say again, and proud work of architecture. The porticos he again turns back to that trusty volume, The Antiquities of Ionia, and borrows from an illustration there. And this amazing, tall, incredible lantern on top comes from the Stewart and Revette's Antiquities of Athens. This is a reinterpretation of the choragic monument of Lysicrides, which was a favorite of Greek revival architects, including William Strickland. But what a building. This is a whole new composition in the Greek revival. Up to this point, it was extremely rare, if at all, to see, for instance, porticos on more than just the front. And here they're on either side. If Gideon had had his way, Gideon and Guthrie, this probably would have had a portico on the north side too, but the lot didn't permit it. So this building was meant to be seen in the round, truly a monument. And so this is something new. This is something new, not just a copy. And I keep arguing that Gideon is part of this whole Greek revival movement around the country, and if not internationally. And you can see how this building kind of fits in with what is happening. And like architects of today, architects back then kept touch with what others were doing. They looked over their shoulders. They watched, not unlike fashion designers. And one influenced the other. And in a really interesting example of the student influencing the teacher, Patrick Snaden, who is a architecture professor at the University of Cincinnati, has this wonderful theory, and that is that the teacher borrowed from the student. In this case, Strickland, in his design for the Tennessee State Capitol in Nashville, done after Gideon had drawn his proposal, his rendering of Jefferson County, he built this Capitol looking suspiciously like what Gideon did. So you could draw the conclusion that by this time, Gideon has become the master. He is no longer the apprentice. The visual evidence is a bit compelling. I'll leave it to you to decide, but can you blame Strickland if he did borrow from his student? Anyway, to wrap up the story of this building, the project became a political lightning rod from the get-go. You had competing government entities under one roof, never a recipe for good things, and the financial problems of the Panic of 1837, which seriously scrimped the budget. Then there was the issue of the building being too extravagant to some people, and another problem with substandard stone that was used. Gideon inadvertently specified a stone for the walls from a quarry upriver, and this stone in the wintertime, when it froze and thawed, had this nasty habit of spalling, and chunks and pieces would fall off of it. So that was a problem. So because of that and the other issues I mentioned and more, the project was ridiculed in the press, accusations flew back and forth, and Gideon lost his lucrative position as city architect, and he lost his responsibility for finishing this marvelous building. The project stalled in 1842 when he lost his position, about half finished, until 1858, when the bridge engineer from the L&N Railroad, Albert Fink, finished it up right before the Civil War, unfortunately having to eliminate a lot of Gideon's tremendous Greek revival flourishes, including the side porticos, reducing the size of the front portico, and of course, gone is that tremendous lantern after the choragic monument of Lysicrides. But, what we still have today is, without question, a triumph of grandeur and an homage to Guthrie and Gideon's vision of Louisville as the great metropolis of Kentucky, undeniably still, even in its reduced form. It is arguably the pinnacle of Gideon's work as the brilliant Kentucky-born architect who so successfully brought the Greek revival to his hometown, to his home state, to Frankfort, to Lexington, and to Louisville, and in the process became one of the great players in this great international architectural movement. Somebody all of us in Kentucky should be very, very proud of. And there's a whole lot more to this story that's covered in the book. And for that additional information, I shamelessly suggest that that book is available at the back of this room. Thank you very much.